Hi, welcome to AI Uncovered. I'm your host, Tim Martin, and also the leader of product at EasyOp, a company creating AI software. In this podcast, I'm going to search to learn everything about AI, the market, the tech, and some real-world applications. I'll be interviewing some experts and folks executing on AI and extracting critical insights about this technology for our listeners. So let's get started on a path of deeper learning about AI. My guest today is Michael Penlington. Michael has been working in pharma for his entire career, including roles in leading development of vaccines and clinical reporting at Novartis, as well as being the senior director of science writing and global medical writing, Center of Excellence at GSK. Most recently, Michael has taken on a new challenge as director of digital clinical development solutions at Nurocor. Michael, thanks for joining the podcast. I wanted to start with a little bit of background here. You spent a lot of your time, you spent a lot of your history in pharma, working in medical writing. What are you up to now?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. As you say, I started in big pharma probably 26 years ago, working as a medical writer, and built up a significant department in 3 companies. Now I have changed. I've started to work for a smaller dynamic technology company, but ultimately what I'm doing, my goal is the same. It is focused on getting quality medicines to people faster. And I think the way I can do that now, the way I can best do that now, is in a different environment. I think technology and the role technology will play going forward will be a revolution compared to how it was in the past. It's a real game changer. So, as you said, I've joined a smallish innovation company, particularly compared to the ones I was at. We are providing technology solutions to help speed up clinical development. I am super excited about my new role, I might add. And for me personally, I'm focused on study design. The company does more than that, but it's what I'm doing. And again, it's what I've had a passion for in the last years. And I guess this can be divided into 2 components. The first is, how can we better design elements or definitions of clinical studies by interrogating big data, by interrogating real world evidence, by looking at a previous experience. And then once we've done that, how can we use those those design elements, those definitions of the study to help inform the downstream activities, the processes, the content of documents, and so on? How can we use that to super and hyper accelerate the clinical process? So I've gone from being a specialist to a generalist, and now I'm back as a specialist.
So that leads me to another question about the clinical process. So you're talking essentially about digital transformation in the clinical process. And I wonder, where do you think pharma companies are today with digital transformation? And what technologies are you using to kind of speed this along with some of your customers?
It's a really interesting question. Big pharma, as the name implies, are big machines. Novartis had, a company I was at before, had 110,000 employees. GSK has about 70,000 employees. These are sizes of fairly respectable cities. Um, now through that expansion, through those acquisitions, they have created mass organizations. But with any mass organization, there's inefficiency, there's overlap of roles and responsibilities, sometimes gaps in roles and responsibilities. So pharma companies are probably, in my opinion, a little bit behind where they could be today for all sorts of reasons, for all sorts of challenges. But I've seen some really big changes in pharma's attitude towards digital innovation, towards your digital space. You know, cultures are changing. people are changing, processes are changing, ways of thinking are changing, and the regulators are changing. When I started out it was Novartis in 2007, I had the task, this was Novartis vaccines, of implementing the first ETMF. And it was radical. Lots of pushback. It was new. It was, it was exciting. It was challenging. Then we went on to introduce an electronic document management system. Then we went on to ECRFs, EICFs. We went on to decentralization. We went on to exploring connectivity devices, embedding other sorts of technologies. So where I think pharma is now is in a position where it is really ready to embrace technologies. Again, there are many, many challenges and it's not straightforward. But what big pharma is really, really good at is things like development, it's things like manufacture. Where it struggles is on developing these sort of highly innovative approaches, these new technologies, these new digital processes. And I think that's where we can really, really impact. We are, by the very definition, large is often not agile. Being a small, highly dynamic company with lots of experienced individuals, we can really shift the needle on this one. I think we can really create value by pushing forward the innovation agenda. And this is particularly with in my case with aspects of trial design, with aspects of defining trial elements. So that's where I think big pharma is. I think we're on the cusp of an exponential explosion in technology.
I seem to feel the same way just by virtue of engaging with a lot of the large companies today on the AI side of things. What do you think's driving this revolution in kind of digital transformation in pharma? What's the force behind all this right now?
One of the stories I always told regarding the need to speed up. The need to speed up is paramount here. But it was with the license of the meningitis B vaccine. Now, meningitis is a rare disease. It killed back in about 2008 between 200 and 300 people, mostly children under 5. It was rare. However, by speeding it up by one day, by speeding the licensing up by one day, you can equate it more or less to one life. Now, as you look at RSV in older adults in the US alone, we have between 6 and 10,000 fatalities per year. If we look at cancer or ischemic heart disease, that's more like 10 million. So by speeding things up, there is a real benefit in terms of public health. Never mind the finance. If we talk about the finance, if we speed up a blockbuster by one day, now a blockbuster, let's say it's 1 billion USD per year, that's 3.3 million USD per day. The financials are very, very clear. But we can have a look at the financials in another way. We can have a look at let's take a document, let's take a clinical study report. When we outsource those, the average cost and there is a massive range here, but the average cost is somewhere between 20 and 50,000 pounds. And that's just a writing part of it. It doesn't include all the work done in-house. It doesn't include the physician or the safety assessment assessor. It doesn't include the statistician or the monitors. It doesn't include regulatory input. So even at this micro level, there's a massive saving in terms of cost. But these have always been true. So why now? What's driving this revolution? Well, I think on one hand, we've seen technology develop. It is now ripe. We have now tangible examples of producing documents by digital processes, by using data elements, by using, to some extent, large language models. These are no longer hypotheticals, that they are definite. And I think very, very few people will challenge the potential based on the technology proven and shown today, that we would not have a massive impact on those timelines. So I think it's just a state we're in. And of course, there are whole loads of other complexities. We can look at the COVID example, where whole studies were done, phase two, one, two, and three in one go. We're done in a matter of months, from conception to filing, within about a year. So I think there's a regulatory attitude for change, but most of all, I think it's the technology is at a stage where people are believing it, they're convinced by it, we have demonstrated value. So I think that's really what's driving the change now.
And when you take a look at transforming the clinical trial process, uh, what do you see as the things holding up transformation? Like, what are the biggest things that keep you from being effective in transforming the start of these clinical trials or the clinical study itself?
From the point of view of a relatively small innovation company, is to get traction with a big pharma. It's to get the sponsorship and investment and the commitment. From a big pharma perspective, I suppose there are a lot of challenges. I mean, one may be a simple regulatory challenge. We talk about artificial intelligence, we talk about large language models, but ultimately, how does a regulator approach these? How does it judge these? How will it assess these? I mean, we hear about things like hallucinations. How do we control for that? So I think there's a lot of regulatory questions out there. Again, it's very technology dependent. Secondly, I think that there is really an element of trust. I mean, it's human instinct. We trust what we know. I worked with these people in this team with this process and system, and we sped things up by X amount of time. I can judge the risks based on my past experience. As we transition into a more technology driven interface, people don't have that exposure, they don't have that knowledge, they don't have that experience. It just makes it more difficult for them to assess. And there's a natural instinct to go back to what I know. And I suppose, I mentioned before that pharma companies are remarkably large and they suffer all the challenges and all the setbacks have been large. I mean, one of those is consistency. It is essential that a pharma company can produce consistent quality, that it has internal controls and an internal control framework, so it can guarantee that the output is of a certain quality. And again, this is difficult in a large organization, a lot of resources, a lot of investment. But again, it is a question as we come in with a new technology, new technologies, how we can guarantee the consistency of output. The regulatory controls, the regulatory environment is becoming more stringent. We talk about bigger sample sizes. There's a need for greater diversity. Great, quite rightly. There's greater transparency needed. But all of these add to complexity. There's also the fact that, in my opinion, having worked there for nearly 3 decades, pharmaceutical companies are naturally risk adverse. I get it. I understand it. We or they are dealing with living people. There are no risks that can be taken on living people. And there's another issue here. I think one is there are a lot of technology companies out there. A pharma company needs to select partners. They need to select in a fairly dynamic world, fairly dynamic environment. Things are moving all the time. Technologies are developing. We're all jockeying for position, and they need to commit and they need to invest based on what is relatively little data. So again, I think that's a challenge as we sort of start to emerge into production, as we start to emerge into having products that really mean something, that really add value. They need to the many out there. Pharmaceutical companies need to weigh up, um, how to invest what could be a significant amount of money. So those, are the challenges, in my opinion. And although we have challenges and will have challenges within within Nurocor, for example, the main one is getting traction with clients to demonstrate value, to demonstrate a product that works. We can save money, we can save time, we can assist them getting um, you know, medicines and vaccines to people earlier. But it different for different. You can see for different pharmaceutical companies, there will be different strategies depending on the state of maturity, depending on the state of development, depending on the strategies. So it's really, really complicated. But for me, the, the biggest challenge is trying to convince the pharma companies, and it's not so much convince, but trying to find a way to engage in a way where we can sort of complementary exploit the technologies.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, it's just starting with COVID. I think COVID was very helpful in some ways to have people take a look at the process and what it takes to get a drug to market. And I think it highlighted some things that could be done better. At least that's what it feels like to me. And then after COVID, your points are all good, right? Technology adoption, that's a challenge. This idea of change management that you brought up, that's a challenge, and this comes up over and over in the podcast. And then just getting a new technology to production, right? The trust, working through all those things, kind of takes some time. And to your point, you can't afford to be wrong, right? There's human lives at risk here. And so we've got to go through this in a very organized and minimize the risk. So I think this all resonates for me and some of the things that I've been through over the last few years in engaging with new technologies in pharma. I wonder, you're working more on kind of the front end study design and planning. I was at DIA in San Diego just a couple weeks ago now, and this ICH M11 standard came up over and over again, and it seems like there's a lot of discussion around this. Can you talk a little bit about the standard and how it impacts what you guys are doing, or how you're working within this standard to make further change in clinical trials?
Yes, I think ICH M11 is super interesting. It it used to be called C sharp. I don't know if it still did, but C sharp stands for Clinical Electronic Structured Harmonized Protocol, which is what it says on the tin. It is what it is. And the two components here, one is the concept, the introduction of a clinical protocol template. The second is the concept of technical specification. So the first part will ensure that protocols are prepared always in a consistent fashion. The content will be consistent. The structure of that information will be consistent. The second part, which is really important, is that it will provide a basis for a harmonized data exchange format, which will be acceptable to the regulatory authorities. So in other words, we can exchange information in real time. And if I think back to when I started out in the pharma sector, ICHE3 had just been introduced. This is the guideline, it's a regulatory guideline for clinical study reports. But until that time, clinical study reports could be 2 pages, or it could be 20 pages or 200 pages. There were no standards, and it made it very, very difficult to mine the data, for regulatory authorities to assess the data. Even within a project, you could end up with one report of 3 or 4 pages, another report of 20 or 30 pages, another report of hundreds of pages. There was no standard there. Now, ICH M11, to my mind, goes so much further because it defines a protocol in terms of certain elements, certain technical specifications. So ultimately, you can, if you like, think about a protocol no longer as a single document, but of granules of information that go to build it. And as those granules will become more and more standardized, you can see greater and greater value in the more and more consistent data.
Yeah, that makes some sense to me. So there's lots of organizations like CDISC, like Transcelerate, that are all trying to make things easier, right? Data standards, kind of document template standards. How does this all fit together with ICH M11?
I think it's highly complementary. Transcelerate produced a protocol template. Now, Transcelerate is an organization, it's a voluntary organization of 20 or so pharma companies. Now, ICH M11, which has regulatory backing, which has regulatory input, is taking this a step further. It's an evolution of something that was created before. And in fact, many of the people looking at the protocol template within the and protocol content within the context of ICH M11 were also on Transcelerate. I think there are basically 3 points. With more structure and more granularity and more harmonization, you get a greater utility of that content. Secondly, the designs will become more standard, i.e. inclusion-exclusion criteria, endpoints. And with more standard elements, it's easier to interrogate and analyze the data. For example, inform endpoints for what really matter to patients, whether it be incontinence in patients with bladder cancers and so on. So there is a massive potential here, which is complementary between the between basically the study design elements as defined by ICH M11, between what Transcelerate has done and what CDISC have done. And of course, CDISC provide the standards that feed into the ICH M11. So that these could be standards in terms, in controlled language, in controlled terminology. It could be dictating standards for the output of the protocol, so it's compatible in a standard format for ADAM datasets or whatever. But it could also be standards for certain information within the protocol itself. I mean, a very stupid and simple example may be a date. This could be in a CDISC, is in a CDISC format, and therefore can be automatically taken out, can be automatically imported, exported. It's really interesting because if you don't think of a protocol as a protocol anymore, but as bits of information, the protocol itself becomes an auto-generated product. It doesn't exist as a document. But if you think of many of the, what is a rate limiting step to the first subject or first patient visit? Well, it could be all sorts of logistics. It could be supplies. It could be contracts. It could be site selection. But in reality, there's no need to wait to the final protocol. If you look at each element with a purpose and a complete purpose, and it can drive a process when it is complete, it doesn't make sense anymore to wait to the final protocol to start off those processes. That's an example. But if you take it further, I mean, ultimately your protocol defines everything, or your study elements, or your study definitions will define everything. They'll define your database. They can define your analysis plan. Ultimately, they can define your report. This is a experiment at the end of the day. We ask a question, we design a study, and we answer that question. It's somewhat empirical. I know there's always going to be unexpected results that need context, that need explaining, but by and large, by standardizing the process, you speed up the process, and you speed up the process because you take out the low value human work and you are more empirical about building content, about building structures, about ultimately going to reporting. So typically today, a fast file between last subject, last patient, last visit to filing is about 6 months. That could be 3 months, or it could be 1 month, or it could be 1 week. Maybe in a different world, but by using highly structured elements, partly to better design your trials, but once they are designed to feed and flow information, I think you can accelerate in a sort of mind-boggling way.
So this is your goal, right? To kind of take this study's design. It sounds like there's some massive parallelization that can go on. It doesn't have to be a serial. And if you can take this process from 6 months down to a week someday, I mean, that's an incredible goal, right? To be able to achieve something like that, like that.
Oh, yes, and it's very much a goal. It's no way a promise or even a strategy. And lots of people will push back for a lot of real reasons, logistic reasons, for cultural reasons, for you know, change management reasons, for technical reasons, and a whole bunch of them. But ultimately, in theory, it should be possible. If you think about a clinical trial as an experiment, then all the effort is put in to the design not only of the clinical trial but of the clinical program.
And I think you're going to tell me, I think this is evident, but it's important to me because we work a little bit downstream from the protocol and work on content generation. But it seems like if a lot of this front end stuff gets digitized, and as you mentioned, it's no longer really a document, but it's a bunch of modules, if you will, or things that can potentially be used over and over again, depending on the trial. And it seems like that this kind of digital transformation will lend itself downstream for more structured content authoring or any kind of content generation, right? Because these elements can be used in documents downstream from the protocol.
I mean, absolutely, and coupled with a variety of technologies. To take a very simple example, ct.gov, clinicaltrials.gov. When you set that up in trial design, you put in your outcome measures, your endpoints. You put in other bits and pieces. You put in how your treatments. You put in your treatment arms. But then for reporting, it's automated. You can't go in and sort of change it. You can't change your table. Now that's a very simple um, illustration of how designs can fix a reporting phase. Now, of course, when we look at a clinical program, it's far more complex than that. But the principle remains the same. I mean, you can incorporate large language models. You can start to look at data interpretation. But in reality, you might even be able to build content in real time. Ultimately, why can't a regulator look at assessment in real time as well? Why can't they use technology to start assessment of a file? And that completely shifts the paradigm.
Yeah, that's obviously a lofty goal and something worth achieving at some point. I guess for me, it's important to put this in perspective, right? So there's a lot of digital transformation going on today. You're working on things that can expedite the study design and planning. You have a unique perspective because you're in a technology company now, but previously you were in the trenches in clinical trials in big pharma. So if I were to ask you the question, what does a clinical process look like in 5 years or 10 years? What do you see out there? What's going to happen?
I think I'm very optimistic. I think we're just at the point in the curve where it starts to bend upwards. And we've already demonstrated that we can start to generate structures, that we can start to flow data, that we can start to generate documents in a digital environment, in a digital way. So I think that's proven. I think in the next 5 years, what I'd really like to see, and what I think is possible, and I think also what Big Pharma wants to see, is that integrated in an end-to-end pathway, in an end-to-end manner. So you know, every company should have, and I suspect they will, a digital strategy, how to flow information, how to use design elements to start to create structures, how to use those same elements, how to start to report, um, and really have a look holistically at the clinical trial. At the moment, it's a little bit bit of technology here, a bit of technology there. How do all these technologies link? Um, so I'm hoping in 5 years or 10 years there'll be demonstrations of really sort of this sort of super digital highway for planning, executing, and reporting clinical trials.
Yeah, well put. Super digital highway. I like the term. So let me just ask a question about AI. I'm always interested in kind of the details there. But if you look at the whole process, as you put it, end to end, where do you see AI impacting things the most, or across the chain, where do you think AI is going to have an impact?
I think it's somewhat cyclic because if you look at trial designs, for example, if you can mine, interrogate real world evidence, big data, if you can start to design better trials, start to identify outcome measures that mean more to patients, that in itself is massive. Then, if you start to use technology to shrink the clinical trial timelines by simply flowing information, but by going back to having standards and harmonization, and ultimately, technology means very little without those standards. Um, I think it's all over. I think the real value, it's a sort of a C squared kind of concept. As it all comes together, the value
E
amplifies.
squared being the speed of light squared?
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
E equals MC concept with the C squared. Um, so the more you have, the more value that you get from it. Uh, so, as I say, today every little bit of technology fits in and adds value, but by linking them all, by having a digital strategy, um, right from design, from your clinical development program, all the way to that reporting step, then I think we're going to see a huge impact.
Yeah, and I think this has already started, and it feels like in 5 years, to your point, there's going to be some dramatic changes. So hopefully, some end-to-end workflows and a lot more digitization. What's your estimate in 5 years as to how much faster the whole clinical process is?
I mean, it's interesting, how long is a piece of string? Today, development can take 10 years, 15 years. We had COVID, which was done and dusted within, let's say, 18 months, depending what you define as start and finish. Uh, but if we look at the buffer in the system, I think we can take significant amounts out of the reporting steps, significant amounts out of the setup steps by design. I mean, a simple example is if we design with the right diversity distribution, we can massively speed up the clinical trials. If we can design trials that will basically engage people who are most at risk of disease, that will be a game changer. And while I mentioned before the metric from from protocol final to first patient, first visit, the real metric is from first patient, first visit to last patient, first visit. That can take sometimes years, and we've got examples where it has done. But there's so much potential here. It's very difficult to say which will have the most impact. But for me, um, going back to how we can shrink, yeah, ultimately, I think we can shrink, you know, the reporting timeline. You know, I've always said, 2 weeks. Whether again, it's a projection here. Uh, Creating the protocol. Well, the protocol in theory can be created instantaneously. Once you've got all your bits of information, I know it's not like that today, but this is looking at the at an objective. Uh, in theory, why not? No, in practice, lots of reasons why not. But the production of the protocol, except for it's a regulatory step, may not even be as important as finalization of the endpoints, finalization of the inclusion exclusion criteria, because they will define your populations. They will allow you to start other processes downstream. So, how much can it be crunched? In theory, you know, an awful lot. Now I know that is in theory, and I know in practice, there are lots and lots and lots of hurdles. But why not? If you look at it as a real-time exchange, why not eventually aim to report within days of finishing a trial? Why not be able to start a trial within a really short time space of finishing the protocol? I know the regulatory pathways here. I know that you've got to produce your medicine or your vaccine, and that takes time.
Yeah.
But I think they could be massive.
Yeah, no, I believe that as well. Okay, Michael, we're at the point in the show where I'd like to do the AI Uncovered Fast Four. So these are four questions that I ask you, and love to get some quick answers. Starting with, do you have a favorite book about AI or any recommended reads about AI?
I mean, I have a few, and here's one. It is Artificial Intelligence Superpowers, China, Silicon Valley, and a New World Order. And it looks at it looks at the two societies, China and the USA, and how they're developing artificial intelligence. And it's looking at the US innovation-driven approach and the China application-driven approach. But in doing so, it goes beyond that. It talks about economic, cultural, political impact, and you really get a sense that it's going to impact all of us in a big way. And I guess it's by someone called Lee. He's been quite clever in the way he's done this compare and contrast. But one point that's really interesting was he talked about job displacement and economic disruption, which is a big fear. What about my job? But ultimately, and I think he's absolutely right, this will create value. It will create jobs. It will boost an economy. There will be pain with change, there always is, but ultimately there's a big opportunity and a big potential here.
Yeah, agreed. And it sounds like a good read. It's the first time that book title's come up. So uh, I'm definitely going to pick that one up. What about a movie? A movie about AI that you've enjoyed or is your favorite?
I've thought about this a little bit, and I've come up with 2001 Space Odyssey. I mean, that must be the best film of all time. Um, I think it is the best film of all time, but it was made in 1968, and imagine in 1968 coming out with a fairly accurate projection of artificial intelligence in the future. There's also a one which was made about a decade ago called Machina, um, which is really about a human android, but it has an interesting, at least for me, implication about this android. Does it start to develop consciousness? And then once it does, is it artificial intelligence? And the third film, which is I'm going to put at the top, is Wall-E, which of course is about a robot that clears all the trashy world that and all the rubbish that human beings have made, and then one day finds a plant. But it's optimistic. It's a it nicely describes what the potential of artificial intelligence is, and it's a great watch for all the family.
Yeah, I agree with that. My kids like that movie. I think all of those movies were impactful. The first one comes up all the time in the podcast. But I think overall you're right. Like these futuristic writers, the sci-fi writers, they just quite an imagination, and they always come up with something that seems to be relevant 50 years in the future, 100 years in the future, right? So, super cool. What about an application that you use frequently? Where have you found either any of these frontier models like ChatGPT or other kinds of more specific narrow-based apps with AI to be significant in terms of their capability in helping you in your day-to-day workload?
Well, in the broadest definition of workload, I've recently moved from Belgium to the UK, and I use chat all the time to ask all sorts of questions to, and it's really it's just amazing. It's like you know, asking a really well-informed lawyer or a really well-informed accountant, which they normally charge $100 or $200, and I'm pretty sure chat comes up with more accurate answers. Um, how do I get my TV license? Um, so yeah, I would say that I use chat almost daily.
I do as well. I'm also using Perplexity AI now. It seems to be very good. I don't know if you've used that.
No, but I'm making a note of it, and I will
You
do.
should check it out, especially I think they're really focused on truthfulness and answering, and I found it to be very interesting in some of the research that I'm doing. It seems like the results are quite good. Okay, lastly, and I ask this question to all of our podcast guests, what do you think will be the date of the singularity when we have uh, artificial general intelligence?
Yes, this is a good one. Um, Now, I, when I started my first postdoc, Gasparov, who was a world chess champion, was beaten by, I think it was Deep Blue, a IBM computer. It's the first time that a computer beat a human being at chess. Uh, okay, that must be a step on the pathway. Then you look at cars, and you look at the sort of automation these days, and you start to wonder whether in 10 years' time, in fact, human beings are needed at all to drive them. Uh, it'd be quite interesting to put a automated car in Formula One with no driver at all, and I'm sure eventually it would win. Uh, but yeah, for me, I think the basic question is when can effectively computers start to improve themselves without human input? Uh, and that I really don't know. 50 to 100 years would be an absolutely unreliable guess. Uh, but and once they start to be able to improve themselves, then do they start to evolve? Um, do they start to develop consciousness? I don't know.
Yeah, these are the burning questions. Well, Michael, I really appreciate your time today. Quite insightful in terms of the digital transformation in pharma, and I wish you the best of luck in your new venture.
No, thank you very much for the connecting.
I really enjoyed having Michael on the podcast today. We talked a lot about clinical study design and planning and the impact that software and digital transformation could have there, and also about the larger picture of the whole clinical process and how digital transformation and AI can be effective there too. He brought a great perspective, being at a new technology startup now, but in a previous life, also living in the trenches of clinical work in big pharma companies. So thanks once again to Michael. I hope our listeners really enjoyed this podcast.